Hello and welcome back to another video as we explore the story. My name is Scott Dalen. I am an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I prepare these videos every week as a companion to a Bible study that is going on within my congregation based on something called The Story, which looks kind of like that in its first printing. The new cover looks a little different. But the story is the Bible, specifically the Bible narrative, condensed down and kind of put together in more of a novel form. Kind of reads more like for lack of a better word, a story than compared to the way it's presented within the scripture, which oftentimes is very disjointed and kind of has some other odd types, genealogies, weird things put in there that can make it very difficult to get into. The story, which is put together by a guy named Randy Frazee, aims to make it more accessible. Now, it is biblical. It is the Bible. It comes from the narrative, but it does as I mentioned, take some parts out. And so we'll hit a lot of the main points, but then some of the things are condensed down. So that's kind of the gist of the book itself that we are studying. And why we are doing it, kind of the overarching thing, or what we call the upper story, that's a theme that's in the story, is what is God up to in our reality? Beginning with the creation and then moving through the fall and the history on through the history of the Israelites, and then on to Jesus and through the New Testament and into the age to come. So that's what this is look at. It's what's going on, big cosmic picture, compared to what's like the minuscule lower face value stuff. That's kind of the stuff that we talk about. This week, which is chapter 10, entitled Standing Tall, Falling Hard, we look at the story of Saul, who was the first king of Israel, as well just before him, the story of Samuel, who's the last judge and prophet who anoints Saul as king and later anoints David as well, but that will be next week. So that's kind of what we looked at this week. From a historical standpoint, if you've been tuning in, last week we heard the story of Ruth, which takes place during the period of Judges. This week with Samuel and Saul, it picks up in the book of 1 Samuel, which is directly after Ruth and takes place right at the end of the time period of the Judges. So there's this roughly 200-year period between the death of Joshua and the leadership of the various judges for the people of Israel, the different tribes of Israel, as they seek to coexist with the native people who are there, and sometimes battle with them, and sometimes take them over, and sometimes not. We pick up with 1 Samuel, also partners with 2 Samuel, as this period of the early monarchy. But it really begins with Samuel. Now, Samuel's not a king, as I mentioned. He's a prophet, and he's a judge. We don't hear much about his judgeship, more about his ability as a prophet, one dedicated to God, the voice of God, and that's really how he is established and what we know more of him in that realm. But with Samuel, we see yet another transition. We've really been in a period of transitions pretty regularly through our study so far. And that's some of what we talked about this evening. If you happen to look behind me, you can see it's dark out my window. And instead of filming this in the morning, like I normally do the next day, I'm filming it tonight. So instead of me saying last night we talked about, now I'm saying tonight we talked about. Sorry, a little side note. But we did talk about Samuel and his call and his role in this time of transition. Now, leading up to this point, the judges, as well as those who came before them in leadership roles like Joshua and then Moses, were also prophets. They were the voice of God, the voice, because the word of the Lord comes upon them and they share that. And so it's really very much of a dual role that we've seen them both in. And at this point, we begin to see that split. And it goes from it being one person who both leads the people as well as is the voice of God into the people want a king, and God's like, fine, take a king. Getting ahead of myself, we'll get to that. And then, so there's the monarchy and the United Kingdom, which really doesn't last very long. And then there's the prophets who kind of split off And sometimes they're with the king because the king is doing well and following the Lord. And sometimes they're in opposition to the king, and sometimes they're both, depending on what's going on, as we'll begin to see. So that's kind of where we're at in this history. Now, in terms of time, we're right about the year 1000 BCE, maybe just a little bit before that. Because King David pops on the scene right about the year 1000 BCE, and Saul reigns for 42 years prior to that. And then we have, but Samuel is old before that starts. So Samuel's story starts around about 1100 BCE, give or take. I don't know an exact figure, but give or take 20, 30 years. Somewhere in that region is when we pick up with Samuel. Now, Samuel's story is interesting. We hear first off of his parents. His father has 2 wives. Sounds weird to us today, but that was normal back then. Polygamy was the way things went. He has two wives, one of which he favors over the other one. The one he favors is Hannah. Hannah has an issue in that she's barren. The other wife is not. She has kids and lords it over Hannah because, haha, I have kids and you don't. God favors me, not you. Ha ha ha. Whatever. They mess with each other apparently. But so Hannah is the favored one. She's barren. She prays and prays and prays so fervently. She goes to the house of the Lord. We don't have a temple yet, so this could be the tabernacle, which is the tent. It could just be a holy dwelling, a holy building. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's not the temple. The temple will later be built in Jerusalem, a little ways down the road. We're not there yet. So this is not the temple we're talking about, but she goes to where the high priest is, and it's the place where they store the Ark of the Covenant. So this is a holy place for them, their place of worship at that time. She goes there and she's praying so fervently that Eli, the high priest, sees her and thinks she's drunk because she's praying so fervently. But she says, no, she says, I'm not drunk. I'm just praying. The Lord hears her prayer. She becomes pregnant. She is so joyful that she has this child. She names him Samuel, which means God has heard me. Perhaps you've heard me say in past videos that their names were very literal. They meant something specific. And that's the case here. So Samuel was born, and Hannah dedicates him to God. She says, I will raise him till he is weaned, and we don't know exactly how long that is. That could be a couple of years. It could be he could be 5 or 6 years old. He could be even older. Somewhere he's still a child. He's still a youth. That's all we know. And he's brought to this holy place, dedicated to God. So he stays there with Eli. Eli is the high priest, and yet, as high priest, he gets about a D- because the word of the Lord has not been heard in a long time at this point. He's been leading the people, and it says that here in the chapter. He's led the people for about 40 years. But the word of the Lord is not heard. Many of the people don't seem to know God. His own kids, who are also priests, end up dying because they're wicked. So things are just not good. Eli is not really doing grandiose. But the one glimmer, and we talked about this, and I use that word specifically for a reason, is that we hear that the light of God had not yet gone out. If you've ever been into a sanctuary now, most sanctuaries have what's called the Christ candle, and it's a candle that is intended to never burn out. It never goes out. It's always burning because the light of Christ is always burning. The light of God is always burning, and if you've read in John chapter 1, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. We see a glimmer of that here. The light of God had not gone out. Whatever may be going on, God is still with the people, even if the people have turned their backs on him, which we see over and over and over again. And if you've been listening to any of these videos, we've heard this. We've seen this cycle over and over and over again. In fact, we talked tonight that things are kind of starting to get a little bit repetitive because we kind of continue to hear the same thing over and over again. And this is true and will continue to, but things are always shifting forward, moving forward, ongoing. That being said, back to Samuel. So he's brought, his parents leave him there once a year when they come to the temple, or not the temple, when they come to the holy place to pray, they see him, so they see him occasionally. But for the most part, he lives there with Eli. And basically serves as Eli's servant boy, because as Eli's getting old, he goes blind and he can't see very well. And we hear that Samuel does not yet know God. He has not yet heard the word of the Lord. And he every night he sleeps on a mat in front of the ark. Now, later when the temple is built, we have the Holy of Holies. It's the inner room. It's behind a curtain. It's where the ark is held, and where only the high priest goes, and only once a year to make atonement for all of the people. At this point, clearly Eli does not have that same reverence for the ark, which is their holy relic. It's where they store the remnants of the Ten Commandments. But he doesn't. It just sits there, and so Samuel sleeps in front of it. That's where he lays. And at this point, God calls him in the middle of the night, Samuel, Samuel, and he thinks, oh, Eli's calling me. So he gets up and he runs to Eli, and he's like, no, leave me alone. I'm sleeping. I didn't call you. This happens 3 times. Finally, Eli wakes up. Hey, way to go, high priest, and realizes it's God calling. So we get that call to Samuel. He tells Samuel, the next time you hear him, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Now, the word of the Lord comes upon Samuel, and it's actually a prophecy against Eli. And when he comes out, he's kind of distraught because, like, this is his surrogate father. It's not his dad, and he knows that, but it's the guy who's raising him. And it's the word that things are not going to go well for you, and your sons are going to die. And lo and behold, it happens because they go out into battle against the Philistines, and the Philistines kill the sons of Eli for their wickedness, and they actually take the ark and take the ark hostage. That's not the right word. They steal the ark, and they have it for several years. And when Eli hears this, he actually falls over and breaks his neck. So things don't end well for Eli. So this is the call of Samuel as a small boy to be a prophet as well as to lead the people as a judge. Now we fast forward to when Samuel has grown old. He's established. Everyone knows he is a prophet, that he's a prophet of God, and that God is with him. And yet, as time has gone on, the people get strung out again, and they get jealous of all the surrounding regions who have a king. And they finally say, we want a king. And Samuel's like, dude, no, you don't need a king. God is king. God is our king. He's told us time after time after time after time, rely on me. Look to me. I will lead you. I will care for you. But God's like, they want a king, give them a king. But tell them it's not going to end well for them. Samuel warns them, it's not going to go well. But if you want a king, God will give you one. And now Saul comes on the scene. And we hear about him that he's young and he's quite a bit taller than everyone else. He stands a head taller, so he stands out in the crowd. But yet he's from the smallest tribe. He's from the tribe of Benjamin and the smallest clan. And it kind of mirrors what we heard 2 weeks ago with Gideon, who was from the smallest tribe and the smallest clan. He was the youngest son, not the person you'd expect to lead. But as we've seen time and time again, God doesn't choose the expected person. Saul is raised up and becomes he's anointed because God tells Samuel, this is the one that I have chosen for you, and anoint him as the king. Now, here's the interesting thing, and we talked about this a little bit. In Hebrew, the word anointed, what we say anointed, is Messiah. And in Greek, it's Christos or Christ. So when you get someone who's anointed, they are a Messiah. They are a Christ. And that's weird for us to think about because we have that connotation with Jesus alone. But yet here in this time, it's true. So Saul is a Messiah. David will later be a Messiah as well. So that's just kind of an interesting little side note. But it's interesting that so Saul is anointed and Samuel presents him to the people. But as he's doing so, once again, he tells the people, this is the story. This is what God has done. I want you to remember this. And we've seen this before. We saw it with Moses before he died. We saw it with Joshua before he died. Always in these periods of big time transition for the people of God, they are reminded of this is what God has done for you. And I think that's with a purpose to tell them going forward, continue to choose God. If you choose God, if you follow God, it will go well for you. But if you don't, it will go poorly. And yet we see time and time again, they forget and they drop the ball. So what's interesting is now as Samuel is anointed, he doesn't actually seem to become king right away. And there's another situation where the Philistines kind of pop up again. And now Saul name drops. And because he gets ticked off and he has these oxen and he cuts them into pieces and he says, He says, we will do these to the oxen of the people who do not come with Saul and Samuel. So he name drops because Samuel is a bigwig and everybody knows God's with him. So he's like, hey, I'm going to I'm with him. He's with me. He's got my back. He's anointed me king. So let's go out and fight the Philistines. And they do, and they win. And as we've seen, a lot of times the people will follow those who are strong. And so this is why Saul is recognized and becomes king. And he's able to unite for the first time all of the tribes of Israel together. First time that this has really happened. Up to this point, they've been very tribal, and yes, they would follow judges, but not all of them would follow, and sometimes they would fight each other, which is odd. We'll see that repeat a little ways down the road, about 3 generations, and then the kingdom is divided and starts fighting each other again. Short memory, people, but it happens. So for the first time now, we have a king, and yet this king kind of resists, and he doesn't do always what the prophet tells him that God said he should do. And because of that, Saul loses favor with God. And he reigns for a long time. He's king for like 40 some odd years. During this time, David comes on the scene. David becomes favored by God. David actually serves under Saul, becomes best friends with Saul's son, and yet eventually opposes him and will become king in his own right. That's kind of what's been going on in our discussion tonight. That's what's happened in this chapter. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, insights of your own, things you're wondering about, things that are like, whoa, that was amazing, please share those down in the comment section, either here in YouTube or down in Facebook, where this will also be posted, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless. We'll catch you next time.